Hi, everyone. My name is Nikita Oberoi, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and to our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right here after the event. If you would like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of the programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. As a reminder, the views expressed in each conversation are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent the National Academies. For today's climate conversation, we'll be looking at coral reefs. Often called the rainforests of the sea, corals support an extraordinary diversity of marine life and play a critical role in coastal protection and global biodiversity. Our speakers today will teach us more about these incredible ecosystems, how they are being impacted by environmental change, and what interventions show promise in preserving these precious marine biomes. With that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Maiya May. Maiya hosts Weathered, a PBS series that aims to educate the public on climate science and our most common natural disasters, how they're changing, and what we can do to prepare. Maiya is a storyteller determined to build a legacy rooted in her love for nature. Inspired by David Attenborough, she creates thought-provoking, nature-related content that strengthens our knowledge, appreciation, and connection to the natural world. With an academic background in geography and atmospheric science, she previously produced weather and climate content for Como TV, Fox 5, Atlanta, WSB TV, and the Weather Channel. Maiya, over to you.
Thank you so much for the intro, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining. So our panelists today will explore the planet's most biodiverse ecosystems, which are coral reefs. And these vibrant ecosystems are not just stunning natural wonders, but they also protect our coastlines, sustain ecosystems, and support the livelihoods of coastal communities. But rising ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, extreme weather events are putting an increased pressure on these fragile ecosystems. So today we're going to hear from some leading experts who bring both scientific insight and on-the-ground experience in understanding and addressing these challenges. And together, we will learn about what's happening to coral reefs, what interventions show promise, and where science and policy must go from here. So today with us, we have Katie Cramer, who is an associate research professor at the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at Arizona State University. She's a historical ecologist whose work reconstructs long-term changes in marine ecosystems due to human activities in order to motivate and inform conservation interventions. Her current research is focused on understanding the role of long-standing human disturbances such as land development and fishing in recent Caribbean coral reef declines and how managing these stressors impacts reef resilience to climate change. And we also have Andrew Baker, who is a professor of marine biology and ecology at the University of Miami, and he focuses on coral reefs and climate change. He also directs the Coral Reefs Futures Lab, which focuses on the development and testing of methods to increase coral reef resilience. And he also leads a new Miami-based project called X Reefs to develop next generation hybrid reefs. And lastly, he recently served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Interventions to increase the persistence and resilience of coral reefs. That is a mouthful. You guys are so accomplished. And I definitely want to get into what got you guys into this space. And Andrew, I want to start with you. What brought you here?
Sure, thanks, Maiya, and thanks everyone for organizing this great opportunity to spread the word about coral reefs. So I'm British originally. I've been in the US for 32 years and came over originally as a Fulbright scholar from the United Kingdom to do a PhD. I came to the University of Miami to work with a professor named Peter Glynn, a coral reef ecologist who had been studying the effects of coral bleaching and El Nino on coral reefs in the Eastern Pacific. He was based in Miami, and I came to work with him and got my chance back in '93 to begin working on coral reefs in Florida and the Eastern Pacific some 32 years ago. So it's just been a great opportunity to witness kind of firsthand what's been going on with coral reefs. And right from the start, as a 21-year-old, I fell in love with reefs as soon as I began diving on them and studying from them, and had the benefit of having a really wonderful mentor.
Awesome. Katie, I'm sure you have a similar story. What about you?
Yes, well, I'm not from a coral reef region either. I'm actually from Arizona, and growing up in Phoenix, I've kind of witnessed this huge population boom, this huge development boom. And so I saw nature being transformed right before my eyes. And it kind of made me realize how humans can impact natural ecosystems in a really short time frame. And it also made me wonder what impacts were humans having before I even witnessed this, before I was born. So I was always kind of preoccupied with thinking about what nature looked like before me, and what was natural. And so then I, grew up being outside all the time. I always loved nature. I knew I wanted to be an ecologist. And I got a job right out of college when I went to San Diego for college. I got a job at NOAA Fisheries. So then I kind of turned my enthusiasm towards marine ecology, and I focused on the impacts of fishing on marine mammals. And that was really cool. I got to go out into the middle of the Eastern Tropical Pacific on these cruises. But I really wanted to be underwater, kind of experiencing the underwater ecosystems myself. And in grad school, I had the opportunity to work with a marine historical ecologist, Jeremy Jackson, who introduced me to the field of historical ecology. And he was focusing on long-term changes on Caribbean coral reefs over hundreds to thousands of years due to human impacts. And I thought it was just really cool that you could use paleoecological data and historical data to go back in time on reefs and really understand how much they've changed, when they changed, why they changed. And it made me realize that kind of what we perceive as natural on reefs is actually not natural. So if you're just looking at modern data, your view of what is natural on a coral reef is really skewed. And so it's really important, to use this older data, historical records and fossils to, go back in time, understand the mechanisms of change, and that can help us better manage reefs. And so that's kind of what I focused on in my recent work.
I think that's so cool. And we have that in common, just the history and nature aspect. I love history. Paleoclimate is like one of my favorite topics in this whole space. So that's really cool. But yeah, let's get into it. And I want to start with the basics. And Andrew, we'll start with you with this question. What are coral reefs?
Well, let's see. Coral reefs are underwater ecosystems that are common in the world's shallow tropical seas, and they're built by corals. The reef-building corals are animals that are benthic, which means they live on the seafloor. They're animals that have some unusual properties. One of those properties is something that I've devoted most of my career to studying, which is their mutualistic symbiosis, their partnership with tiny single-celled algae that photosynthesize and use sunlight energy to make food, which they pass to the coral. And that allows the coral to give it a sort of supplementary energy source that allows these animals to build skeletons and grow much faster than they would if they didn't have those algal partners. And that means that these corals are able to build over time, hundreds and thousands of years, structures underwater, habitats that are built out of limestone, out of calcium carbonate. And over time, those underwater animal forests build habitats that support millions of marine species. So they are, in many ways, sort of the trees in the rainforest. They're the organisms that are building the habitat, but they're really doing it by virtue of this partnership with algae that allows them to be sort of photosynthetic animals, able to capture sunlight and use the sun's energy to build that ecosystem. And that property of being mutualistic animals with algal symbionts is not only the key to their success, why they've become so common in these shallow areas of the world's oceans, but it also underlines or underscores why they're so vulnerable to climate change, which I'm sure we'll be talking more about in this conversation. So it's that unique property of corals that is, I think, really a focus of a lot of the attention on coral reefs today.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the algae of it all and how climate change impacts that. But first, Katie, I just want to hear from you. Why are corals so important? Not just ecologically, but culturally as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, Andrew did a good job explaining, why corals are kind of a fundamental organism to reefs. They're the architectural species that form that three-dimensional structure that makes reefs the most biodiverse ecosystem in the oceans. And corals are really important culturally. They're central to many cultures around the world. I'll just use one example. In Hawaiian culture, their creation story states that life began with the coral polyp. And so all subsequent life therefore came from coral. And so coral is a deity in kind of Hawaiian spiritual traditions. And so other cultures also kind of revere corals in that way, especially island nations. And it's very important to protect corals, therefore, because they are a source of livelihoods, food security, storm protection. And so from a practical standpoint, they're really important too, just for reef adjacent communities.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Just the fact that they not only are significant culturally, but they protect our coastlines from storms, sea level rise, storm surge during hurricanes. But yeah, I mean I feel like people when they think of coral reefs and they see pictures of coral reefs, they're like, oh, that's a plant. No, it's an animal. So Andrew, thank you for pointing that out. These are animals that build reefs, and the reefs support other marine life. So it's really a beautiful, beautiful ecosystem. And we're going to dive deeper and we're going to talk about the impacts of climate change on coral reefs. But first, I do want to remind the audience to ask questions through Slido in the box below the video. And so, yeah, let's get into this. Let's get into this deeper conversation. Andrew, I really want to get into this biggest, I feel like the biggest stressor to coral reefs, which is climate change. So how is our changing climate impacting coral reefs?
So thanks for that question. Yeah, this is really the key question of our time, really, which is coral reefs are probably one of, if not the world's most vulnerable ecosystem to the effects of climate change. And they mainly experience those effects through rising temperatures. During unusually hot summers, which we're seeing more of, corals get stressed out by the heat. And this stress is reflected in episodes of what we call coral bleaching, when the coral turns pale or white. And the reason it turns white is that symbiosis that I mentioned before breaks down, and the coral begins to expel its algal symbionts in long streams of mucus out of the mouths of the coral polyps. And once that symbiosis is broken down, and once the coral begins to pale and turn white, that nutritional benefit that the corals receive from having these algal symbionts turning sunlight energy into food is lost. And that renders the coral vulnerable to starvation and vulnerable to all kinds of other impacts that it can't fight off because it doesn't have the energy reserves to be able to do that. So as heat stress builds up on reefs, corals get progressively more stressed and they tend to bleach more and more severely. And over time, we've been seeing more and more severe coral bleaching events all over the world, to the extent now that there's really very few, if any, areas of the world's reefs that have not experienced a major bleaching event. And in fact, there are many reefs that have experienced multiple bleaching events. And each time these bleaching events kill off more and more corals as they find themselves unable to deal with the stresses and strains of everyday life. And in fact, some of the most recent bleaching events, like the one that we saw in Florida in 2023, built up so quickly and were so severe that the coral's tissues not only sort of bleached, but literally sort of disintegrated, almost melted, as people have described it, off the skeletons, because the stress was just so extreme that the coral was not able to respond in even the usual way, which would be to try to sort of bleach and expel its symbionts. So heat stress is becoming a really severe factor for reefs. And it's a global threat. And it's the kind of thing that We need to aggressively begin to try to address, not just by restoring corals and working on ways to make corals more thermally tolerant and better able to deal with this, but obviously we have to also be dealing with the root causes of climate change, which is carbon emissions, to try to stem these temperature marine heat waves that are building up. And at the same time, we've also got to keep protecting coral reefs from the local everyday stressors that corals have been facing ever since humans really began to impact these ecosystems. So we have sort of three balls to juggle at the moment: climate change, local impacts, and interventions to try to increase the heat tolerant resistance of corals.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I do want to drill down on just the bleaching. Because corals can recover from bleaching events. And from my understanding, the key threat is the increased frequency of these bleaching events. That's the problem. With climate change, we're going to see more and more of these ocean heat waves that cause these massive bleaching events. And the corals are just not going to have time to recover, because it takes a little time to recover from these bleaching events. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Andrew or Katie? Go for it.
I could pick it up and then hand over to Katie. Yeah, you're right. You're exactly right. The problem is that bleaching events are not only becoming more frequent, but also more severe. As the Earth continues to warm up, the amount of heat stress that occurs during these summer heat waves is just increasing over time. And each event is, progressively becoming more severe than the last. So corals have this challenge that while they might recover from a regular bleaching event, given enough time, on the order of a few years to a decade or so, the return times between bleaching events are now starting to decrease, so that there's just not enough time between events for corals to recover. And again, it just spurs more attention on the need to try to utilize the latest science and incorporate it into restoration to try to put out corals that are going to be as thermally tolerant as they can be, as a way to try to give corals a fighting chance at surviving the next few decades of climate change. And I'll hand it over to Katie to add extras.
Yeah, Andrew, I think you set that up well, just that corals are dealing with these other stressors that humans are causing on a more local scale, while they're also trying to deal with this increasing kind of accelerating crisis of thermal heat stress events. But yeah, a big, I believe, understudied stressor that humans have been putting on coral reefs for some time, and this is also increasing as climate impacts are increasing, is land-based pollution. And this is from agriculture, tourism, urbanization, which is ramped up over decades in many coral reef regions. And this pollution can be in the form of sewage, nutrients, fertilizers, pesticides, other toxic chemicals, plastics, sediments, and all of these have been shown to have negative impacts on coral health. And in many cases, in the case of nutrients and plastics, have been shown to exacerbate coral disease and make corals more prone to bleaching during these heat stress events. So there are these combined or synergistic impacts happening. And so if we want to give corals a better chance of dealing with these thermal stress events, we need to reduce these local stressors, including pollution. Another local human stressor that makes corals less happy is overfishing. There are lots of organisms on the reef that eat algae, herbivorous fish, and urchins and mollusks, and benthic algae that kind of live on hard surfaces on reefs. They can compete with corals for space. They can sort of leach out nutrients and harm the corals. They've overgrown a lot of reefs as corals die after bleaching events. Algae can take over, and then there's no space for baby corals to settle on any longer. So when there's overfishing happening, that's also a problem. There's also the problems of unsustainable tourism practices, invasive species from shipping, and then a more recent stressor that I witnessed last year during my fieldwork in Central America, and this is also climate related, is just fires. Fires are impacting the tropics now. These humid areas that never used to burn are now burning over large surfaces, And as we saw with the wildfires in Hawaii, there's a lot of toxic debris from those fires that can also impact corals. There's a lot going on, a lot for corals to deal with right now.
Wow, I didn't even think about wildfires I mean, when I think about corals and how they're suffering right now, my mind immediately goes to climate change, and everything Andrew said makes a ton of sense. But I don't often think about the human related stressors, the stressors outside of these climate driven impacts. And wildfires is definitely not on my list of things that can affect coral reefs in a negative way. So that is very interesting. And Katie, I'm going to stick with you with this question. How are coral losses currently affecting things like food security, our livelihoods, and local economies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just beginning to be quantified in economic terms, but reef building coral loss continues on this current trajectory. The reef structure will continue to erode. Reefs will not be kind of growing, they'll actually be dissolving. And so that structure, structure will begin disappearing. And so there'll be, fewer fish associated with that habitat, fish that people like to eat. There will be less tourism, there will be less storm protection, and there'll be more flooding and more storm damage. And so although I don't think there are a lot of studies quantifying this quite yet, I can point to one example. There was a recent study that showed projected coral reef loss in Florida could increase coastal flood risk to thousands of people and cost almost $1 billion annually. And so I think Florida, South Florida is dealing with these flooding events even during dry periods, and that could get worse with sea level rise and then with the loss of the reef structure as well.
Wow, $1 billion. That's crazy. Andrew, how can we fix this? How can we increase coral resistance from a climate perspective? What interventions look the most promising right now?
Yeah, so this is a huge question and a huge challenge for coral restoration practitioners and coral scientists interested in climate resilience. You mentioned earlier on that the National Academies convened a panel a few years ago to try to review all of the possible ways that scientists might increase the heat tolerance of corals, and being part of that panel had a chance to be involved in reviewing all of those potential interventions and looking at which ones were the safest, which ones could be scaled up. And I have to say this field is moving quite fast. That was already 5, 6, 7 years ago. And since then, a lot has happened. I think, first of all, there's a renewed appreciation for the fact that we have to do something. If we continue to operate trying to restore coral reefs the way that we've tried to do this for the last 20 or so years, we're not going to be able to build any kind of heat tolerance into corals fast enough. We're going to have to operate much quickly, and that means trying new things, trying new paradigms, and looking for some transformative ways of doing this. Some of the most promising ways of doing this involve restoring reefs using methods that are a little different from what we used before. 10 or 20 years ago, restoration practitioners around the world were leveraging the fact that corals are clonal organisms. They're animals, but they're clonal organisms, and so they can be divided and fragmented into pieces, and each of those little pieces can grow and become a new colony. And this tremendous property of corals allows you to propagate corals very quickly and produce hundreds of fragments from a single colony that over time can grow into hundreds of new colonies. And people very successfully leverage that ability to generate a lot of coral tissue and to try to put it out on reefs as a way to kind of help restore the lost coral cover. But of course, the problem with using that method, which is a form of asexual reproduction, clonal propagation, is that you're just replicating the same genotype over and over and over again. And, diversity brings resilience. It brings novel genetic diversity to populations that allows corals to adapt. And we've seen that those methods, although they're very good at producing lots of coral, they don't produce a lot of new diversity. It's kind of implied that over time, those corals will sexually reproduce with one another. But as we've talked about before, climate change is such that we don't necessarily have the time to let natural populations do their thing naturally. So over the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a huge change in focus in the coral restoration field to sexual reproduction. So this is the idea of leveraging the fact that corals are organisms that can reproduce sexually. They produce eggs and sperm that can be captured by scientists, either in the field or increasingly in the lab. And the gametes, the eggs and sperm that are produced from those corals, can then be bred with one another in interesting ways to produce corals that may have more thermally tolerant properties. For example, you could pick the corals that have survived bleaching events and try to selectively breed from survivors as one way of trying to do that. But the other thing that this approach allows you to do is by working in the early life stages of corals, not only is it much more scalable because you can now have thousands and thousands of coral larvae or recruits, baby corals, in a single tank, which you can't do when you're fragging corals that are, fairly large and take a lot of time and tank space to do. But because you're also raising corals from their first days, you have an opportunity to intervene to do some interesting things to them. One example is you can give them heat-tolerant algal symbionts, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. My first exposure was actually working with Nancy Knowlton at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, another great mentor of mine that I was lucky to have. And ever since the early 90s, the idea that there was diverse algal symbionts out there on reefs, and that some of those symbionts were heat tolerant or were varied in their physiological abilities, was really the intellectual hook that grabbed me in my career as being the thing that I really wanted to work on. There was an increasing appreciation back then, was I was starting off, that corals could change their symbionts. Corals could switch out one type of symbiont for another, and that allowed it to change its responses to certain kinds of stressors. And the one that we've become more interested in is heat stress response, and the discovery that there are heat tolerant symbionts. And you can give heat tolerant symbionts to corals in the early life stages, and that gives them a sort of a head start with those kinds of algae that, if you then plant them out in the right areas, means that they then grow out with these heat tolerant symbionts that allow them to survive some of these bleaching events. They impart 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade of additional thermal tolerance. So working with sexual reproduction for coral restoration allows you to not only scale much more effectively, it allows you to engage in what you might call selective breeding by picking parents. And more recently, we've started picking parents from outside of, for example, Florida. So the idea that we might breed corals internationally is a new thing that we've just begun doing. And here in Florida, we've received a permit to allow us to outplant these new individuals that have been crossed from different countries with the purpose of trying to insert more heat tolerance into those populations. So it's actually, despite the threats that corals face, it's somewhat ironically a really exciting time to work in this field, because people are interested in trying new things, trying to do all that we can, and recognizing that if we don't try these things, the consequences of doing nothing are in all probability much, much worse than trying something. And so there's a lot of energy around trying the things that are going to have this impact in increasing heat tolerance and then scaling them up.
Yeah, I think that is so cool. And I actually got a chance to do some fragmenting in Florida at Moat Marine Laboratory. It was really cool to learn about, just how they're picking and choosing which corals to invest time in. And I was actually in Florida in 2023 during the ocean heat wave. And we went out at the beginning of the heat wave and we saw all the bleaching. And we were, with people who were, doing these coral farms out in the ocean and of course in the lab. And we went back after the heat wave to see how many, or what the percentage of the corals that survived, and it wasn't a lot. And I will say, I don't know if the corals that they had planted were the heat resistant corals. But this leads me into my next question, which is my biggest question of all. And I've asked this question to different scientists on the show. So I'm very interested to hear both of you guys' point of views. can these reef interventions scale fast enough to match the pace of climate change? Because I've read stats like even if we limit global warming to, our goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll still see a loss of 70 to 90% of corals. And I don't know how accurate that is, but that is a stat that I've heard. So is this work really worth it? I know, like you just said, we definitely want to try things. That's better than trying nothing. But have we already reached a tipping point? A point of no return for coral reefs? I think that's a very valid question to ask in this moment.
Again, I could kick it off and pass to Katie. Yeah, I mean that's the $6 million question. It's probably the $6 billion question, perhaps. There is, I think, a strong feeling that coral reefs have already passed a transition point, and that whatever coral reefs were able to respond going forward will not necessarily resemble the coral reefs of the past. Coral reefs are novel systems, and we've already lost, perhaps 40, 50, 60% of the world's corals, depending on the region you're working in, or more. So the idea that, that we're going to get back to the reefs of the past is a very, very ambitious order. And the thing to keep in mind is that, coral reefs, in their sort of stable state, their climax state, so to speak, are kind of like old growth forests. They're the kinds of ecosystems that take centuries to build up. And once you lose them, it's very difficult, it's impossible to get them back again in any kind of short-term way. Coral restoration is very much a long-term game. It's akin to restoring old growth forests from seeds that you're planting out onto a reef, and you're hoping that over the decades and centuries that follow, those reefs can restore itself. I think the challenge that restoration faces right now is not the challenge of bringing back in our lifetimes the reefs that we've lost over the last 50, 60, 70 years, but enough ingredients on the reef that will allow coral reefs to recover once we get the climate crisis under control, to avoid losing enormous amounts of biodiversity in the meantime. So I think restoration, in my view right now, is all about throwing lifelines to corals to try to preserve as many species as we can and as many environments as we can, to have enough raw ingredients as possible to allow the natural process of reef recovery to recover over the next decades and century or more, so well beyond the scope of our own careers. Is it worth it? Yes, I think it's absolutely worth it. But the challenge of how we do that is the $6 million question that I mentioned earlier. I think we have to find interesting new ways of raising the capital to be able to do this at scale. And I think here in South Florida, one of the things that we have used to try to generate the kind of support that we need to bring these ecosystems back is the point that was made earlier by Katie, that coral reefs actually are very effective barriers, very effective coastal protection mechanisms for preventing threatened coastlines from the really damaging effects of coastal flooding. And just in Miami-Dade and Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, we have a tremendous amount of built infrastructure that is very close to the shoreline. And studies have shown that while the natural system off that shoreline is worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year in avoided damages, we can actually bring back coral reefs faster using some hybrid reef approaches to try to further increase the value by hundreds of millions of dollars a year more. So given the threats that Southeast Florida faces, and given its enormous amount of built infrastructure, there's a lot of interest in using corals and other nature-based solutions to protect coastlines. And that, I think, while it's locally important, that is the key to how we go about scaling up operations in Southeast Florida to try to restore reefs at scale, by recognizing and building back reefs in areas where they can afford protection that has quantifiable dollar values and can affect things like insurance premiums and the reinsurance industry and so on. So I think part of solving this challenge is not just about innovating and bringing new science or bringing automation or robotics or interventions into the coral reef pipeline process, but it's also about innovating on a regulatory capacity, and it's about working with stakeholders to get people to understand what the value reefs bring above and beyond the kinds of things that Katie and I fell in love with, which was, you know, biodiversity and the beauty of coral reefs and their sort of biological value, but realizing that they have tremendous societal value too. And I'll hand over to Katie now.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
I do. I have some thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I'm not actually in the restoration space, but yes, we can't just stand by and watch this massacre without trying something. That's just not part of human nature. We want to intervene. We're solutions oriented, I think, as a species. But I think that sometimes it gets lost that there's a really powerful intervention we could take, which is just leave the reef alone. There's a big, you know, in terrestrial restoration and rewilding, it's been shown that forests will come back often if there's enough trees left to kind of reseed. If you just leave them alone, stop disturbing them. And there are, you know, interventions that people have been taking over decades to try to do that. So there's one traditional form is ring protected areas to protect reefs from overfishing and let the reef fish populations return. But a really kind of undervalued approach that really needs to ramp up in pace with restoration is reducing land-based runoff, is reducing the pollution aspect. So in Florida, we just take Florida as an example, you know, before these global bleaching events, you know, over 50% of the corals were already gone from Florida. And a big reason for that is the pollution. And so, you know, we have to accept further loss in the future. That's just the reality of things. But we've already lost so much, even before these, you know, massive, large-scale global bleaching events. And a lot of research has shown that corals were actually already showing signs of disease, slowing down their growth rates before big signs of climate change. So of course, climate change is devastating to corals, but these other things have played a role as well. And so we have to do this in tandem. We have to pair the restoration with the reduction of overfishing and pollution. Try to do things like we're like also facing a plastic pollution crisis. And, you know, plastics have been found in corals. Corals ingest the plastics. They can actually lead to disease because a lot of harmful microbes actually hitch a ride on these plastics and make their way into the corals. So it's definitely worthwhile to do the restoration piece, but we also can't lose sight of trying to manage those other things that humans are doing that are making corals less resilient to the climate impacts.
Yeah. And I want to ask one more question before we get to the audience questions, because I do want to leave time for that. But I think this is an important question because this looks at the future and next steps and how we scale these intervention strategies. And yeah, Andrew, I'll ask you this question. You know, we know policy is key in pushing this work forward. Are there any governments that are prioritizing coral reef preservation and restoration? And if so, you know, what are their approaches? Give us some examples, and not just on a federal level. Like I know there are things that can be done on a state and hyper local level as well. In some cases, some of those strategies can be even more efficient than things done on a federal level. So, talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny you should ask that question because I just got back earlier this week from Australia. Australia obviously has the Great Barrier Reef. It's fundamentally kind of part of the Australian identity and something they really value very highly, and which they also recognize is under great threat from climate change. So a few years ago, Australia, kind of following the lead from the US and the National Academy of Sciences report, launched its own program called the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. That was really designed to somewhat aggressively explore new interventions to increase heat tolerance and try to upscale restoration efforts using these new technologies. So Australia has really come a huge way in a short time in this space. And I serve on a group that essentially helps assess the level of risk in applying some of these new interventions and tries to help the Australian government come to some sort of strategy to move these forward and scale them up in a sensible way. In Florida, so that's an example of one government that's doing this really aggressively and investing heavily in the process of trying to do that. In the US, we've also done this. We haven't done it in quite such a centralized federal way. NOAA did ask the National Academy of Sciences to produce this report as a way to try, I think, to sort of stimulate work in this area. But we don't have a sort of federal program that is investing quite as heavily on the scale of the Australians in this kind of intervention space. Having said that, we do have a program from NOAA that is a grant program from NOAA, a grant project from NOAA that has been funded to try here in Florida to bring together all of the restoration practitioners to begin to work together and coordinate their efforts in this intervention space to scale up their efforts and to try to learn from each other and try to make sure we're operating as quickly as we can. So we're really excited about that. And then at the state level, I think we're lucky that in Florida, the state leadership has also recognized, much like Australia, that Florida's coral reefs are an iconic ecosystem for the state and have invested really heavily over the last 5 or 6 years in a program of coral restoration and conservation, and have really invested in helping build out land-based facilities that support some of these approaches that I mentioned to do with sexual reproduction and breeding and algal symbiont provisioning, as we call it, giving corals the thermally tolerant algal symbionts. So I think Florida's been really a leader in that space. There's been some interesting developments also at the federal level. You mentioned earlier on that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, invested in 2 programs in the US, one in Florida and one in Hawaii, to invest in developing the next generation hybrid reef structures that I mentioned that could protect coastlines using biologically friendly materials and new designs that help attenuate and break waves more effectively. And as part of that, invested in groups to engineer corals that are going to be more thermally tolerant and can resist these kinds of new environments that we're putting them in. So there has been a lot of interesting federal investments, including new ideas and new transformative approaches like the DARPA one. At the state level in Florida, we're lucky to have the support of the governor in this. And at the local level, I mentioned earlier that places like Miami-Dade County that are really exposed to these kinds of coastal stresses have also recognized and have woken up to the fact that there are inexpensive, relatively speaking, ways of trying to protect coastlines by using nature-based solutions like coral reefs, but also, dune restoration and mangrove restoration. And I think what we're seeing is appreciation, but there needs to be a portfolio of different approaches. And those are the kinds of things that are going to help buy time for the kind of societal change that we'll need to undertake over the next few decades.
I love that. There are options, there are things that we can do, and there are things that are happening. I love that. Let's get to some audience questions. And I love this one. What is a source of hope that keeps you guys going? Because as someone who hosts a climate show that is very doomy and gloomy, I can say firsthand, it is hard to find hope in a lot of these situations. And especially I feel like the coral situation is one one that it's like, what is the silver lining here? But you guys explained some very explain things from an optimistic point of view. And I like a lot of the strategies that we have here to build off of. But yeah, I'm curious to hear from you. What is your source of hope that keeps you going? Katie, you can start.
I think I have kind of 2 sources of hope. I don't know if I'm optimistic necessarily, but I have not given up hope. I don't think you work in this field if you've given up on hope. But one source is just the capacity for nature to kind of be more resilient than we give it credit for sometimes. There are some bright spots. There are some reefs that are actually still flourishing and recovering in unexpected places. Like, for instance, I was in Belize last year, and there was one coral species that has just been decimated, Acropora cervicornis, across the Caribbean. It's on the endangered species list. It's, like over 90% of its population has died since the 1950s. And there were reefs that had gone to 10 years before where that species was gone. And then there were these huge thickets that had recovered. And that was just, unexpected and incredible and very hopeful to me. And so I think that in certain patches, like maybe these are these thermally tolerant genotypes that Andrew's been talking about, that are trying to, breed with species from other places or with colonies from other locations. So that's one source of hope, is that we're not going to lose corals everywhere. And we're not going to lose reefs globally. They're going to be really different, and they're going to be more restricted in areas and maybe less biodiverse, and maybe their functioning will be different, but they're not going to disappear off the face of the earth. The other source of hope I have, and maybe you can relate to this, Maya, is like taking the long view. Over geologic time, coral reefs have faced much larger fluctuations in the environment, although the environmental changes didn't happen as rapidly back then as they're happening today. But reefs have persisted in some form or another over millions of years. And so we are gonna still have reefs in some form. They're not gonna, disappear off the face of the earth.
Andrew, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to something I mentioned earlier, that when I first came to Florida in the 1990s, I remember the folks who had worked in Florida here since the 70s would tell me, oh, if you think reefs are great now, you should have seen what they look like in the 1970s and 80s. And although I appreciated what they were saying, to me, the reefs of the 90s, they still looked pretty good, and they were still exciting to dive on. And here I am, we're in the 2020s, and it's tempting every time new students come to the lab and we go diving. It's tempting to tell them, oh, you should have seen the reefs in the 1990s. And I recognize that sounds like me being the old timer, telling them how things used to be. And I guess the point of what I'm trying to say, what gives me hope, is that even to a newcomer's eyes, the reefs of the 2020s look incredible to someone who's never experienced them before. And although it is tempting to sort of shake them by the shoulders and say, don't you realize what we've lost? That kind of loses the point that we still have something amazing out there, something that is worth losing. And it's easy, if you take the long view and you've been around a long time, to focus on the losses, but we still have so much more to lose. And I worry that we might look back in the 2060s and say, gosh, if only we could have the reefs of the 2020s now, what we wouldn't give to have those reefs. And here we are in the 2020s. We can't lose hope. We still have amazing systems out there worldwide. And while reefs, are on, have been characterized as being on sort of a slippery slope to slime, I think we've got to make sure that that slippery slope is as rough as possible, is as frictionful as possible. We've got to make sure that the slippery slope that they're going down is, we fight for every single loss of resilience, because that's what's going to be important in the long run. And we'll wish years from now that we had done more to prevent those losses. So I take a lot of hope in the fact that every new set of students that comes through is still amazed at what we've got, especially when they see reefs around the world, not just in Florida. And I think we have to convince ourselves as old timers that as good as we may have seen it in the past, there's still amazing stuff out there. And if we were visitors from another planet, or if we visited another planet and found these ecosystems as they are now in the 2020s, we would think they were amazing and absolutely worthy of our attention and struggle to survive. So we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, it's all about perspective. I love that. And I feel like this is a good segue to this question, which I'm very curious about. What would the Earth, marine and land habitats, society, cultures, etc., look like and be like without coral reefs? Either of you can start.
I don't want to think about that. But I would say,
Sure it is. I mean, I feel like that's a valid question in this moment. And I've never thought about that. So yeah, I would love to hear just from your expert knowledge, paint a picture of what our society would look like without these reefs. that support 25% of marine life.
Yeah, I think we would have a diminished marine coastal ecosystems in the tropics, and there would be, a lot of human suffering because reefs provide food security for a lot of reef adjacent communities. So there would be less food from the ocean. There would be less tourism. I guess I'm just thinking of if corals were gone. I don't know if that's the right way to think about this question, but we would have maybe reefs, and this is happening already in some locations. The reefs are kind of, the dominant organism is changing. So it could be sponges in some locations, or it's algae in other locations, or maybe it's soft corals that aren't building the reefs, like sea fans. So it would just look different. There would still be life there of some sort, whether it's plant or animal life. There would be reduced diversity, reduced probably food provisioning for local communities. And that is just already happening and, on a smaller scale. I can't imagine life without reefs at all, because I don't think that's going to happen. That's too sad.
So I'm going to make a plug for biodiversity. So as you mentioned, Maya, reefs are home to somewhere between a quarter and a third of all marine fish species, which depend on them at some point in their lifespan. And you can look at that and think about, well, the species that will be lost and what will be the impacts on commercial fisheries and animal protein production, and how might human systems have to adapt. And I think all of those arguments are really important. But as a biologist, I'm going to make a plug that reefs really are warehouses of biodiversity in the marine realm. In fact, there's an argument to be made that they are the most diverse ecosystem on the planet from a phylogenetic point of view. There are more wild experiments in life going on coral reefs than there are anywhere else on the planet. Animals that have evolved over millions or billions of years to deal with the peculiar challenge of living life on Earth. And as a kid, Maya, you mentioned being inspired by David Attenborough earlier on, and he was my hero growing up, still is, just turned 99. And being a child of the 1970s, I grew up with a TV show called Life on Earth. And that show I remember watching as a kid. I was allowed to stay up late to watch it. And it was all about diversity. It was all about the amazing planet that we had inherited that had all of these other creatures that shared the planet with us. And that notion that we were somehow aboard a ship traveling through space full of this amazing menagerie of organisms, kind of like a Noah's Ark, I think really captured my imagination as a kid. And every time we imagine a future where we have, through mismanagement or underappreciation, allowed that arc to become less diverse, to lose species that we can never get back, species that we perhaps never even knew they existed before they are gone, and that we've allowed the planet to become increasingly dominated by a few species that have become important to us for livestock or other reasons. I think that is a tremendous loss of the human spirit, really. And so I think coral reefs, if we're going to make a push to save any of the world's ecosystems, coral reefs cover less than 1/10% of the world's surface area. Not a huge amount, relatively speaking, and yet they're full of all this biodiversity. So they really are target ecosystems for protecting that Noah's Ark that we inherited. And if we don't try to do it, I think that's a massive failure of ourselves as a species. And
Yeah.
I really think that's why I'm in the career I'm in.
Yeah, I love that. And I think this is also a good segue to the next question I see on here that I would love to get your thoughts on. What are the most frequent challenges or constraints associated with coral reef restoration efforts so far? And what are the most effective strategies to overcome them? And I'm going to lump two questions together. How can the public help in mitigating the harm being done to these coral reefs, and how can they help, with the restoration and policy and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I guess start on the frequent challenges and constraints. I think it was, and I think that the challenge and the constraint is twofold. It's the scaling challenge. How do you produce corals fast enough to compensate for the rate of loss? And how do you make the corals that you're generating or restoring able to deal with the conditions of the future? So you have to do both of those things at the same time. It's no use just making a few dozen corals that are amazingly resilient. You've got to be able to do that at scale, and you can't just rely on the same 2 dozen corals. So you've got to try to work on maintaining diversity in your restored coral population, while at the same time making sure that you're doing it at a big enough scale to make a difference and keep the system going, keep the ecosystem alive. I think I'm excited about new attempts to work internationally that I mentioned before. The idea that we can try in the Caribbean to harness the biodiversity that's in the Caribbean to breed corals from the whole area and use those corals to enhance restoration efforts around the region to make sure that that we're not relying on the genetic diversity that's within our own local management jurisdiction to overcome a global problem. We have to work at least regionally to solve that problem. And like I said earlier on, that involves thinking a little bit outside of the box. But I think it's well worth attempting.
Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
I could speak to the, what can we do to help reefs, even if we're not living next to a reef, is just kind of recognize that our actions impact the kind of dominant stressor that's impacting reefs right now, climate change. And so we can help reefs by advocating for climate action, reducing our own carbon footprint. If we visit reefs as tourists, just enjoying them in a sustainable way, making sure the food we eat from the reef is caught sustainably. And just recognizing that we are all connected, and so our actions actually impact reefs far away they may be from us.
Yeah, the key here is figuring out a way to get to net zero carbon emissions, and the biggest way that we can do that is by advocating for climate policy and clean energy. So yeah, I love that answer. Question that we did not get to in our conversation that I think is important. What is the current understanding of the effects of ocean acidification on coral reef calcification and metabolism, et cetera?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit. So ocean acidification is like the other side of the two-edged sword of carbon emissions, right? As we put CO2 into the atmosphere, it has a greenhouse effect. It causes the planet to warm up, and we've talked a lot about efforts to deal with that on the coral restoration space. The problem with CO2 in the atmosphere is it also dissolves in the ocean, makes it more acidic, and a more acidic ocean means that corals are less able to calcify, can't calcify quickly enough to keep pace with all of these stresses that we've been talking about. As far as the current understanding of the effects of ocean acidification, I think we've learned quite a bit over the last 5 or 10 years about the specific mechanisms by which that happens at the kind of cellular stage. The idea that there are processes going on in the coral's extra calcifying medium that the coral can, on some level, compensate for by pumping in more chemicals into that calcification space to enhance the process of calcification by offsetting the decrease in what's called the aragonite saturation state, the thing that's actually controlling how coral calcium carbonate crystals are forming in that space and being assembled into the coral skeleton. And so there's an appreciation of the fact that it's not quite just a physicochemical challenge. It can be offset by the coral's biology. The coral can compensate for some of that, but it requires the coral to be as healthy as possible with enough energy reserves to be able to deal with that. And as you can hear from what Katie and I have been saying, the corals are under so many threats that it's like asking the coral to, compensate with an extra heavy lift when it's already having to deal with other factors. So it is a big problem. I would say that it's not quite as pressing a problem from a conservation point of view as rising temperatures are. But it is nevertheless something that is constraining the long-term capacity of reefs to survive in certain parts of the world. And as the oceans get more acidic, it's constraining the kind of available habitat space in the world's oceans where corals can actually thrive. And so that's something that we're definitely concerned about as well.
Interesting. Katie, I'm going to ask you this question. Are there any resources that you would recommend for people looking to grow their knowledge and even careers in ocean conservation?
I mean, the NOAA website has amazing information about coral reefs if you're interested, in general, and then just kind of ocean management and conservation and restoration. There's some restoration information in there too. There is also a plug for an organization that Andrew's involved in. If you're interested in the coral reef restoration space, there's the Coral Restoration Consortium, which is sort of a like recently formed entity to get all the practitioners together, and it has great resources on their webpage too. I think if you're just interested in ocean conservation in general, there's a Seven Seas Media has a great webpage that has links for events, jobs, like ocean conservation jobs too, opportunities for students as well. So there's some kind of online resources I would recommend.
Andrew, what about you? Do you have any recommendations for people looking to grow their knowledge and if they want to get into ocean conservation as a career?
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of things that inspired me as a kid, obviously, were the things that I mentioned. I think television and media have an amazing role to play in disseminating information and inspiring kids, especially. For those people who are, maybe considering a career in this area, I think, yeah, there's tremendous resources online. The NOAA website has been mentioned. Most of the large NGOs have sections on coral reefs. So the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Nature Conservancy, the World Wide Fund for Nature, they'll all have great information about the work that they're doing in different parts of the world around this. And certain states will also have a lot of really useful information. The state of Florida and DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection for the state of Florida, runs a whole set of web pages about the value of reefs and the research that's been doing and the work that the state is doing to try to do that, to try to compensate for the impacts. So yeah, I think there's tremendous amount of resources out there, but and then there's things like this, the thing that we're doing, trying to sort of disseminate the challenge and the opportunity as well that we currently face.
Yeah. Also a good segue to this next question. What can be done to raise public awareness of the coral crisis and what everyone is losing in this moment of coral reef decline? And I can add to this as a science communicator. I can add to this. And this is, like what really gets me excited doing work in this space. It's just improving the messaging and communication. Like Andrew, like you just said, doing more webinars like this. I think, what we found in making the show that we make, Weathered with PBS, is that, I believe the reason it's so successful is because we discuss these often complex and sometimes mundane topics in a way that really hits home with our viewers. I feel like if you can connect it in a way that's like, okay, this coral reef decline is going to affect you in your life in this way. I think if we can improve that, the communication, I think we can improve overall education, and the public will be more likely to demand the programs and the policy needed, not just on a federal level, but on a state and hyperlocal level to just improve the understanding and the efforts to preserve and to restore these coral reefs. But I mean, I'll throw it to either one of you guys. Do you have anything to add to that question?
I want to just add for me something that was powerful to get me kind of interested in understanding the state of reefs and how much it changed. And I hate to be that old timer going back to, oh, they were so amazing, before I was born. But just seeing old historical photos and videos of reefs and just the immense bounty of animals on them and how the corals were like, it was like an underwater forest, and just how incredible and complex and like surreal. It's almost like a Dr. Seuss seascape. And it still is that way in many places. But just seeing those old historical photos was like so awe-inspiring, and to me, a really good communication tool to track changes over time. So you just kind of understand the scope of change. And it can kind of inspire you to maybe set your bar higher for what may be possible. Like Andrew mentioned, we're not going back to the reefs, the 1950s in many locations, probably. But let's expect more too, and realize like how amazing these systems they still are, but they used to just, be like, blow your mind when you saw them. I thought that was a good communication. So like a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And the other
Go ahead.
thing, of course, is which we haven't talked much about is social media. I think here I am talking about as child of the 70s, growing up watching nature documentaries. I wish people were still doing that, but they're not. The kids of today are not watching those kinds of programming, and I think recognizing that social media is a really effective tool for getting this message out, and scientists as a group are not generally a great user group of social media in terms of effectively communicating their research. And when we do it, we tend to be tweeting or commenting on the paper that we've just published, or the student that we've just recruited into the lab, and it's not really designed at the general public in mind. Obviously, there's a lot of exceptions, but I think we definitely need that base of interest to try to get the message out, because that is how people are getting their information these days, and that's how people are being inspired. And everybody's been down the TikTok rabbit hole and found that they've lost a couple of hours somehow. And I think getting more content on there that helps communicate about these ecosystems and tries to capture people's imagination about what is there and what could be lost, I think is obviously a great opportunity as well.
Yeah. So anyone in the audience inspired today from this conversation, go on social media, make a TikTok video or reel explaining why coral reefs are important and why we should focus on restoring and preserving them. That is incredibly helpful. It could go viral. You never know. And I do have another question for both of you. Which species or locations should we prioritize for conservation going forward, and why? I think that's a very interesting question.
Oh, that's a really good question. I could just speak to corals. I mean, and I work in the Caribbean. So in the Caribbean, there's one genus that has 2 species or 1 hybrid species that are just different than any of the other corals. They're sort of like the canopy trees of the rainforest. They grow, 10 to 100 times faster than any other corals. They're like the tall branching species. And so they, in many like shallow reef zones, contribute the most to reef accretion, reef growth, and most of the calcium carbonate that you find on the reef that provides the reef structure. And those are the corals from the Acropora genus. And it's already been recognized by the United States government that they're important. They're both on the endangered species list. And so they do, in theory, have some protections. So it's important to prioritize those, but it's one thing to just, say they're protected on paper, another to actually do the protecting. And kind of one beef I have with that in the US at least is that they're on the endangered species list. They're given this critical habitat designation that should be protected, but that habitat's not really being protected from pollution, for example. And so, one solution to that would be amending the Clean Water Act to include, best management practices on land to ensure that the water reaching those corals that are protected is actually clean enough to allow them to make that environment hospitable to them, especially if they're being outplanted. They're recently restored little outplants that are there. Give them like the environment they want to give them the best chance to survive. So to me in the Caribbean, those coral species are really important. Those are the ones that are kind of the early focus on that fragmentation because they're the ones that reproduce, asexually by fragmentation. And in the Caribbean, those are kind of the flagship species that have been targeted for protection.
Andrew,
Yeah.
really, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, I agree with Katie, and I think these kinds of decisions are very region specific. In the Caribbean, focusing on the tuatropras as the main kind of framework builders of shallow reefs, I think is really key, and that has been sort of the policy going forward. In other parts of the world where there's a lot more biodiversity, we have a real challenge on our hands because obviously you can't restore every single species out there. You have to make some decisions, and so decisions that follow the same kind of logic, which is let's try to focus on the relatively fast-growing species that build the reef, in the hope that by building the reef and retaining that habitat and that ecosystem, you're providing enough space, so to speak, for these other coral species to still have a chance at surviving, despite the fact that they're not being actively restored, sort of riding along on the coattails of restoration. I think that's really the strategy. And so, yeah, focusing on the corals that build most of the structure is a good place to start.
I love that. Last question. And this will be, just quick rapid fire. What is one takeaway that you would like the audience to leave with after this conversation? Katie, you can go first.
I think I would just kind of plug again that we do have an impact and we can alter the trajectory of coral reefs just by trying everything we can to, bring carbon emissions down. And I would say, there's a lot of technologies now that are negatively and, adding to the carbon burden that reefs are facing, like AI and crypto, and just realizing that some of these things that we're participating in might actually be negatively impacting reefs, and kind of just trying to educate ourselves around that. And again, just trying to advocate for climate action in local and, national, global scales. Also, the plastic crisis too is something that is just reaching a point of like a tipping point, I think, for coastal ecosystems and reefs. And there's a global plastics treaty that's being negotiated right now. So kind of getting involved, in that, and also in local efforts to reduce plastic usage and consumption of single-use plastics included. Those are kind of some of the things that we could do.
Andrew, what about you?
It's kind of similar. My message would be, don't give up hope. There's still a lot to fight for. There's still a lot to be lost, and we'll look back at this day in the future and perhaps wonder why we didn't do more. And while we're doing that, we've got to keep working on the root causes underlying these declines, whether they be carbon emissions or whether they be poor management of water quality in different parts of the world. All of these things, we can't take our eye off those buttons, off those challenges, but at the same time, there's still plenty to fight for, and it's an exciting time actually to be working in this field.
I love it. I love it. Awesome conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. I will pass it over to the staff at this moment.
Thank you, Maiya, for moderating that wonderful conversation. Katie and Andrew, thank you for all the work you do and for sharing your insights on this very important topic. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for your interest and excellent questions. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same webpage immediately after we end. If you found the webinar informative, we encourage you to share it on social media. Also, if you haven't already, please register for our climate newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn at NASEM Climate to get updates on all things climate at the National Academies. Our next conversation will take place on June 13th at the same time. We'll be hosting a discussion on methane emissions and opportunities to both reduce and remove this potent greenhouse gas. We'd also like to thank our colleague Susan Roberts at the Ocean Studies Board for supporting today's conversation. And as always, a big thanks to all the National Academy staff who made it all happen behind the scenes. Thank you all again for joining. Take care, and we'll see you again in June.